When a man scratched Sian Simmonds' car outside her home, she invited him inside to exchange insurance information. Hours after the stranger left, Sian was found dead. The killer left behind a clue so obvious that the police thought it must be a ruse, but it was actually the start of unraveling a multi-layer murder plot. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. Quick reminder that I'll be in North Adams, Massachusetts for the opening of Studio Both And. Ticket information is in the show notes. It is October 14th, and I hope to see you there. This episode is going to be a long one, so let's jump right into it. With a thank you to my friend Lars for suggesting this one. I really do use many suggestions sent into me, so feel free to keep them coming. And also with a shout out to the book Fatal Prescription. It is by John Griffiths, and along with archival newspaper research and other court documents, Fatal Prescription was one of my main sources, and they are all linked in the show notes. Let's get started with Sian Simmonds, and I'm saying Sian, S-I-A-N, not Sean, S-E-A-N, and she grew up in Surrey, British Columbia with her older sister Katie and her parents, Chris and Sue. Chris and Sue Simmonds had moved to British Columbia in the late 1960s from southwest England, which is near the Welsh border. Sian is a Welsh name, and she was named after her aunt when she was born on her aunt's 16th birthday, January 28th, 1973. Her name took on even more meaning when several weeks after baby Sian was born, her aunt Sian was killed in a car crash. In spite of this early tragedy, Sian grew up to be a carefree young woman. After high school, she enrolled in Kwantlen College, which is now called Kwantlen Polytechnic University, to study environmental health. Sian was a hard worker, so 5 days a week she would finish classes and then head to a nearby restaurant to work, which is how she helped pay for her studies. She and her boyfriend David planned to get married when she finished school, and they had been together since they were around 16. Sian shared a basement apartment with her sister Katie, who was also her best friend. Their family actually owned the multifamily house they were living in, and the upstairs neighbors were their aunt and cousin. So this was the perfect blend of freedom for a young adult while still having family support very close by. On Wednesday, January 27th, 1993, Sian's sister Katie left for work in the morning, and Sian called her boyfriend David to wish him a happy birthday. The two had plans for a lot of celebration that week because the next day would be her 20th birthday as well. She told David that she had class around 1 and planned to just do housework until it was time to go, but she said she'd call him back before she left for school. Around 10:45, Sian spoke with her mother on the phone, and after that, around 11, Sian was on the phone with her friend Kim when there was a knock at the door. Kim heard a male voice apologize to Sian and say that he had scratched her Jeep. Sian told Kim she would have to call her back. Around 12:30, David had not gotten a call back from Sian as promised, so he called her. When she didn't answer, he hung up and called her back, thinking maybe she was just upstairs talking to her aunt. And she didn't hear the phone ring the first time. When she didn't answer the third time in a row that he called, he left a message assuming she forgot to call him before she left for class. It was then at about 2 p.m. that Sian's Aunt Jillian, the one who lived above her, called 911. She had gone out grocery shopping after lunch, and when she got home, she noticed the light in the basement was on and the door was slightly open. She knew Sian should be at school and Katie was at work, so after she put her groceries down, she called down to their apartment to see if everything was okay. When she didn't get an answer, she went downstairs. Jillian entered the apartment through the double doors that led to a small entryway/sitting room space. Directly across from the doors, Jillian saw Sian propped up against the wall and covered in blood. She immediately ran back upstairs and called for help. First responders arrived at the scene and they confirmed that Sian, one day from her 20th birthday, was dead. As they processed the scene, they wanted to get Jillian's statement as soon as possible, as she was a potential witness. The police asked Jillian about the events of the day leading up to the discovery of Sian's body. She told them that earlier in the day, before lunch, a man knocked on her door and said that he had accidentally scratched a red Jeep parked nearby. He was looking for the owner to give them the information for insurance purposes. Jillian told him that that wasn't her Jeep, but it was her niece's who lived downstairs. She directed him to the apartment entrance and then went about her day. While she was doing housework, Jillian said she did hear something that sounded like 2 muffled gunshots, but because of how muffled they were, she didn't think they came from downstairs. They sounded more like they were coming from outside. It turned out that those were likely sounds from the killer. Sian was shot twice, but neither of those shots were fatal. The actual cause of death was that she had been beaten to death. Based on what the medical examiner observed on autopsy, it looked like Sian had been shot twice first and then beaten with the gun. This information had to be hard for Jillian to process. While she was upstairs doing housework, her niece was being brutally murdered nearby. Jillian's account of the man scratching Sian's car was backed up by a few other witnesses. One was the friend Sian was on the phone with at the time who said she heard a man's voice essentially say he had scratched her car. The other 2 witnesses were neighbors who separately told the police that they saw Sian outside with a man while looking at her Jeep. They both had looked out their window at that time because they heard Sian raising her voice as she was pretty upset about the scratch, which was about 12 inches long on the driver's side door. Like any nearly 20-year-old with their own car, she was pretty protective of it. Both neighbors got a pretty good look at the guy before he and Sian went back into the apartment. So we have 3 witnesses early on who saw the man who likely killed Sian, her aunt, and the 2 neighbors. And it turned out there was a 4th who came forward after he heard about the murder. He was a mail carrier in the area, and he reported seeing a ponytailed man get into a Dodge Omni and take off. Suspicious about the way the man was acting and knowing there had been a few break-ins in the area, the mail carrier wrote down what he could see of the plate number as the car sped off. The fact that this was a Dodge Omni that the man sped off in tracked with some information investigators found at the crime scene. Inside Sian's apartment was car paperwork for a Dodge Omni. This paperwork seemed so obvious that the police first thought it must be fake. It was a red herring. A guy came by, claiming damage to a car so that he could get into the apartment, and then he handed Sian some paperwork that he just so happened to leave behind. Surely the paperwork was fake since he didn't bother to grab it as he left the crime scene. No criminal could be that sloppy. But then the mail carrier came forward and said he saw a Dodge Omni. So maybe someone could have been that sloppy? It was a lead regardless, so the investigators quickly tracked the vehicle information to a man we are going to call Bill. I'm only changing his name because his real name's Brian and there's another Brian in the story and it's going to get confusing. The police pulled his photo and showed it to the witnesses who all said he was absolutely not the man Sian was with that day. But the police still wanted to talk to him to figure out who could have had his car insurance information and or was driving his Omni. The investigators reached out to Bill's mother, who he mostly lived with when he wasn't out partying and couch surfing elsewhere. They asked her to have him call them as soon as she talked to him. So while they're trying to track down Bill on that first day of the investigation, Sean's family was interviewed. Katie was asked about anyone in Sean's life, like an ex-boyfriend, who may have been behind something like this. If anyone knew about any problems Sean was having with people, it would be Katie. But she said no, she couldn't think of anyone. However, when they asked Sean's father, Chris, he brought up one person, though it was almost far-fetched. About a year and a half before Sean's murder, both Katie and Sean filed complaints against their family doctor, Josephus Charalambos, who went by Joe, which is a good thing because I'm only guessing at how to say his first name. These were not police complaints, but rather professional ones made to the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, which is Canada's regulatory board that oversees doctors and surgeons. Both of the complaints filed were similar, accusing Dr. Charalambos of inappropriate behavior towards them. It started when Katie confided in Sean that she went to the doctor and mentioned quitting smoking. He congratulated her by hugging her, which, okay, but then he kissed her on the mouth. Sean said the same thing happened to her, and the more they started talking about other things he had done during exams, including possibly touching one of their breasts, they began to realize that he was being inappropriate with them. Not knowing what to do about it, they asked their father, Chris, who then helped them file a formal complaint with the college. The college gets a lot of complaints every year, so it takes a while for most of them to be investigated. And if there is anything to back up the accusations, a hearing will then be held. So it took about a year of investigation before the family learned in November of 1992 that a hearing would, in fact, be held about these accusations. There would actually be 2 hearings, one for each of the young women, in early March 1993, which was scheduled for about 5 weeks after Sean's murder. So the police had Bill, or his car at least, and Dr. Charalambos to follow up on. Fortunately, it did not take long to find Bill, whose mother let him know the police were looking for him. He called the police the morning after Sean's murder and agreed to meet with them where he was, but not at the station. Thankfully, he was still where he said he would be when the police got there, and he was willing to talk. When Bill was asked about his car and who had been driving it the day before, he told the investigators that his friend David Schlender had asked to borrow the car for an hour on January 26th, which was the night before the murder. But David didn't come back in an hour. He kept the car all night. The next morning, Bill did call the police to see if his vehicle had been reported as having been involved in a crash, or maybe it had been towed, but they had no record of it. Bill was pretty upset about this, but David did eventually come back with the car. When asked what time David showed up with the car, Bill confirmed it was returned in the afternoon, shortly after the murder. Bill was asked if David had any bruises or scratches on him when he returned the car, and Bill said he didn't notice anything like that, but he did see David had a big stack of cash, something David rarely had. David was an active and heavy drug user, so money didn't last long when it was in his possession. He certainly didn't have that much money because he saved it up. The police then ran David's name, and what popped up was kind of shocking. He was out on bail at the time, and the crime was attempted murder in what was believed to have possibly been an ordered hit. In June of 1992, it was alleged that David shot a man who was a cocaine dealer in a parking garage. The man was shot twice before the gun jammed, and David was accused of then hitting the man with the gun, which was similar to what happened to Sean, shot twice and then beaten. This man, however, got away, and David was arrested. Without a documented history of violent offenses and with the victim's history of being a drug dealer, David's attorney successfully argued for bail, which surprised many. At the time of Sian's murder, the case had not gone to trial yet, and David was free, and apparently borrowing his friend's car at the same time a murder took place. The police pulled David's photo, and the witnesses said he looked like the man they had seen. So Bill dropped off the suspect list, and David was at the top. The investigators went to David's house, and they staked it out until they saw David get out of a cab with his wife and go inside. At 4 p.m., the day after Sian's murder, the search warrant came through, and they entered the home, arresting David on suspicion of murder just 24 hours after Sian's body had been found. David would give a total of 6 statements to the police, and in statements number 1 and number 2, which happened shortly after the arrest, David said he didn't know what they were talking about and knew nothing about any murder. The police, however, were pretty sure they had their guy, but they also had no motive for him. David didn't know Sian, they didn't run in any circles together as far as they could tell, and Sian had no connections to drugs, which seemed to be the basis of all of David's previous crimes. Eventually, though, they were able to find out a motive because David eventually decided to talk to them. He had been considering the benefits of confessing and trying to make some sort of deal, except rather than reduced prison time, his real focus was on safety for himself and his family. He had a wife and 2 daughters to think of, and the people involved in Sian's murder, according to him, were dangerous. So in exchange for his confession and the names of the people who were really behind this, David wanted 2 things. First, his wife and 2 daughters needed to be relocated at the government's expense and protected. And 2, he wanted to serve his inevitable prison sentence in another province. In British Columbia, he didn't think he stood a chance at surviving for very long. So after this deal was ironed out, David told the story start to finish, or one version of it at least. According to David, he owed a drug dealer named Brian West a lot of money. David's cocaine addiction was out of control, and depending on the source, he was in debt anywhere from $3,000 to $7,000. Brian approached David and said he would forgive the debt and give David some more money, but he needed something taken care of for a friend of his. According to David, in interviews number 3, 4, and 5, this friend of Brian's was a karate instructor who needed someone to scare 2 sisters out of testifying against him. Of course, the police already knew that the person the sisters were going to testify against was Dr. Joe Sherrilambos. And do you want to guess who put himself through medical school teaching karate and still owned a martial arts school? According to David, the initial plan was to pour gasoline through the mail slot and then set the house on fire to send a clear message to back out of testifying, or worse would happen. But they eventually came up with a plan to have David go to the apartment to scare them with a gun. So in interviews 3, 4, and 5, David said there was no plan that he would kill anyone. The plan was to scare them. And by the time he went through with this and went to the house, he had been told to just worry about one of the sisters, the one with the red Jeep. And there had been time for the plan to change like this because David had attempted to turn down the job. And when that didn't work, he started delaying it. David had actually been first approached by Brian West in November, which just so happens to be the same month the college decided to hold the hearings, and Dr. Sherrilambos would have been informed of that. David said he turned Brian down a few times before Brian eventually showed him pictures of dead bodies and said that would be his family if he didn't help. David's logic, which was influenced by drugs, was that Brian would find someone else to threaten the Simmonds sisters, and then he would hurt Brian's family. Going to the police didn't really occur to him, and so with that, he took the job. David said that he was basically handed the plan: scratch the red Jeep, go to the door to apologize, and once allowed in to exchange insurance information, David was supposed to threaten Sian with the gun, telling her not to testify or he'd come back and kill her. And then he needed to just leave. David said he didn't realize that Sian lived downstairs, so he had gone to the front door first. When he was directed towards the basement apartment, Sian answered the door while on the phone. And this little bit of information helped bolster this confession. Whenever a confession is made, it needs to be vetted against the evidence, because false confessions do happen. The fact that Sian was on the phone when she answered the door had not made it into the media in the 24 hours between her body being found and David being arrested. The only way he would know that little detail would have been if he was there. David said that after Sian looked at the car and let him in to get his insurance information, he asked to use the bathroom. Sian sat down in that front entry room area to jot down the information, and when David came back out of the bathroom, he had a Ruger on him with a silencer attached. David had that gun out, and it was pointed at Sian's back. When she turned around and saw the gun, she did something David hadn't expected. She jumped to her feet, screamed, and then started fighting for control of the gun. There was a brief struggle for the gun when David fired, shooting Sian in the jaw. She then put her hands up to shield herself when David fired again and hit her arm. These were the shots that Sian's aunt heard, but because of the silencer, she thought they were coming from farther away rather than the basement apartment. At this point, Sian was in a fight for her life, and she kicked David in the groin. He said that in a rage, he turned the gun into a bludgeoning weapon, and he beat her, hitting her at least 7 times on the head and causing massive trauma. When he fled the house, not having expected things to have gotten so out of control, he forgot to grab the paperwork. The real kicker here was that he was never supposed to use a car that linked back to him. Brian had given him $700 to cover whatever expenses he had, and that included getting a rental car, preferably in someone else's name. But David blew the money on cocaine, and he had to borrow his friend's car instead. And because he used his friend's car, it seemed illogical to him to just use his friend's insurance information and registration paperwork as well, which is how he got caught. A judge would later say of David, and I'm quoting this directly, "Intelligence does not appear to be Schindler's long suit." David said that after he killed Sian, Brian gave him an additional $1,200, which would explain the cash Bill had seen on him. David's statement also bumped Dr. Joe up to the top of the suspect list, and the investigators were also now looking into this intermediary, Brian West. If Joe had told Brian to hire David to simply threaten Sian, there might not have been a lot they could have done to hold them accountable for her death, legally speaking. However, the police did not think that's what happened. For one thing, why go to all the trouble of a ruse just to threaten Sian? David could have followed her to college that afternoon and confronted her with threats when she got out of her car. Or he could have made threatening phone calls. Instead, he went through a big performance to get her into her apartment where they could be alone and in private. Additionally, if he was there just to threaten Sian, he didn't need to load the gun, and he really didn't need to attach a silencer to the gun. the silencer was entirely unnecessary unless the plan was to shoot her. But the police still had a question on this motive. Dr. Joe being involved gave them one, which David wouldn't have had without pointing the finger in that direction. But it still seemed like a lot to have someone killed or even threatened over a board hearing. Sian wasn't testifying in court. This wasn't a legal process that could land Joe in prison for any length of time. So what was the real impact Joe would have been trying to avoid? The police reached out to the College of Physicians and Surgeons to find that out. How big of a deal was this hearing? Now, they learned that the hearings were not held unless the investigation found that the complaint was substantiated in some way. That didn't mean he would necessarily be found guilty of misconduct or face any consequences, but it meant there was a decent chance. As far as what those consequences would be if he was found guilty, Joe was likely facing suspension of his medical license for at least 6 months. But due to Joe's past, it may actually have been longer, upwards of 2 years. 2 years where he couldn't work as a doctor, and he wouldn't be collecting his $450,000 annual salary, which would be more like $800,000 today, according to the inflation calculator I found on the Bank of Canada website. So let's get into Joe's past a bit and see what led up to this point. And we're going to start at the very beginning when Joe Charalambos was born in 1952 on the island of Cyprus to a Greek family. The 1950s were a period of turmoil in Cyprus as they fought for independence, and when Joe was 8, his family emigrated and settled in Canada. Joe was a good student, and he was very ambitious, planning on being a doctor since he was a little boy. While he was in medical school, he taught karate to help cover his expenses. But what is more notable to what we're talking about today is that he also had a few run-ins with the police. In 1978, Joe was charged with common assault after he hit a woman who turned him down for a second date. While on probation for that, the police were called to his apartment in the middle of the night. 2 men had charged into the apartment and were trying to take Joe's TV after accusing him of underpaying a sex worker. He fired his gun at them, hitting one of the men in the hand. He was not charged in this shooting, as the men were essentially committing a home invasion at the time, and it was seen as self-defense. Joe was lucky he wasn't charged. A second charge while in medical school could have resulted in him being disciplined or even expelled, which would have impacted or ended his career before it really even got started. But once legal consequences were off the table, the school was limited in what they could or would do. Then, in August of 1979, again while he's still a medical student, a complaint was filed against Joe by a sex worker. She had flagged down a police officer and said she was performing a sex act on a man who began hitting her out of nowhere. She got away from him and jotted down his license plate. The officer ran it, and the car was registered to Joe. It's not clear exactly what happened after this, but charges were not pressed. So in spite of these 3 police investigations into him, 2 of those involving attacking women, Joe graduated in 1981 and moved on to his internship. In 1982, he was a full doctor. The next time Joe was on police radar was August of 1985. His sister's friend flew into Vancouver for a visit after having moved to the States years before. I'm going to call her Nicole since I do try to protect the identities of survivors. Nicole had known this family for years, and one day while she was in town, she went to the horse races with Joe with plans to go to dinner with Joe's family that evening. After the races, they went back to Joe's house so Nicole could lie down and rest before dinner. She went upstairs to nap, and Joe followed her. From what Nicole later told the police, Before she could even process what was happening, he grabbed her and started dragging her into his bedroom. She tried to fight back, but he managed to overpower her and get her on his bed. He got her skirt and her underwear down as she begged him to stop. In an impulsive, grasping at straws moment, she just asked him if he would at least let her go get her Bible. And somehow that worked. And according to Nicole, Joe just suddenly let her up. So Nicole ran into the room where her things were, and she was confused about what had just happened. She believed Joe was about to rape her, but he never attempted to remove his own clothing. And almost as quickly as the attack began, it was over. It really wasn't making sense to her in the moment. Nicole called her father from Joe's house and said she needed him to come get her immediately because Joe had just tried to rape her. Joe heard this, and he picked up the extension saying that Nicole was schizophrenic and needed to be placed in an institution. Nicole grabbed her stuff and waited outside Joe's house until her father got there, and then she reported the assault to the RCMP. Joe was charged, but eventually the charges were stayed due to lack of evidence and what the police called inconsistencies in Nicole's statement. Nicole, who was not getting justice in the courts, printed up flyers calling Joe a rapist and put them up around the area of his medical practice. But that wasn't the only legal or professional issue Joe was facing at the time due to his own behavior. The same summer Nicole was attacked, Joe started spending time with two patients of his, a woman named Jacqueline and her 15-year-old daughter named Shelley. I am not changing Shelley's name here because she has already changed it herself, and that identity is protected. So using her birth name won't help anyone identify her today. Jacqueline thought Dr. Joe was just a caring family doctor, taking an interest in her and her kids after her divorce. This interest was outside of the role as a doctor, and he spent time with the family in the evenings sometimes and sometimes on the weekends. But then Joe started showing more and more interest in Shelley specifically, which raised alarm bells. Jacqueline told Shelley to not be alone with the doctor. Then one day, while Jacqueline was at work, Joe went by the house and picked Shelley up to take her to lunch and a movie. Shelley knew she wasn't really supposed to be alone with him because her mother said so, but she was 15 and this was a 33-year-old family doctor who she trusted. After this, Shelley wanted to keep seeing Joe, who showered her with gifts and attention. One time, Joe took her to the horse races and gave her $350 of his winnings. Shelley felt really special and began thinking of this kindly older doctor as her boyfriend. This was a textbook case of what we now call grooming. First, Joe impressed Shelley's mother and built trust with her, and then he turned to his target, a 15-year-old. He groomed the family and then the child. Jacqueline caught on and tried to intervene, but by that point, Shelley was infatuated with this older man who she believed loved her. And that's when Joe started separating Shelley from her mother whenever he had the chance, like showing up when Jacqueline wasn't home and telling Shelley to disobey her mother's rules. He made Shelley promises saying that his money and connections could help her become a model or maybe even an actress. Compared to that, her parents didn't really have that much to offer. And he was also pushing Shelley's physical boundaries, though she had still resisted having sex with him. But as things progressed in what Shelley thought was a relationship, he threatened to find a new girlfriend who would have sex with him. Shelley didn't want to lose the relationship she thought she had, and because she felt she owed him after he had given her so many gifts, she was coerced into having sex. Jacqueline didn't know if things had progressed to that point, but she did suspect it. The more she tried to keep Shelley away from Joe, the more Shelley pushed her away. One night they got into an argument and Shelley stormed out of the house. Her stepfather went to go look for her and he found her at a payphone. As he was trying to convince her to get in the car and come home with him, Joe pulled up and she got into that car and the two drove off. Her stepfather tried to follow them in his car, but Joe ran red lights to get away. Shelley was gone all night, and then in the morning, Joe called and told Jacqueline that Shelley was not coming home. She was going to stay living with him. So Jacqueline went to the police to report this. And the police saw this as a runaway situation and didn't intervene much at all until September 20th. That's the day Nicole's accusation had led to an arrest warrant. Knowing Shelley may be in the house, the police told Jacqueline that if she was found there when they arrested Joe, they would bring her home, which they did. With Shelley home, Jacqueline wanted to press charges against Joe, but Shelley would not cooperate. The police wanted Shelley to confirm that the relationship was sexual before they did anything, and Shelley just would not do that. When Jacqueline realized the RCMP were not going to do anything, she did the only other thing she could think to do, which was complain to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. While that complaint was pending, Shelley went to live with her aunt, and then in January of 1986, right around the time she turned 16, she ran away from her aunt's house and moved in with Joe. Now that she was 16, there seemed to be even less the police were willing to do. Joe told Shelley that her mother was trying to manipulate her, and that was reason enough to cut her off. So most of what Jacqueline knew was going on in Shelley's life came from her school counselor, who would call her with updates, like when Shelley showed up to class in October of 1986 wearing an engagement ring. This timing was not a coincidence. In August of 1986, Joe got a letter in the mail regarding Jacqueline's complaint of inappropriate behavior towards Shelley. The college had found enough evidence to move forward with a hearing. And that's when Joe very soon tried to legitimize the relationship through an engagement. Joe hired an attorney to legally challenge the constitutionality of the hearing, which did help delay it. And that gave him time to take Shelley to Las Vegas in March of 1987 to get married. Though she was only 17, Joe forged a birth certificate that made it appear like she was 19. Joe hoped the marriage would help get the complaint against him dismissed. What it did was make their relationship more public than it had been before. A few patients side-eyed him, being that he was in his mid-30s and he was now married to a 17-year-old, but many still supported him. Joe told them it was different back home on Cyprus, and it was within his Greek traditions to have an age difference marriage like that. A 17-year-old marrying an older man was no big deal. People accepted this, and he saw, surprisingly, or surprising to me, very little impact on his practice. However, the marriage was not enough to get the college to dismiss anything. When the hearing finally happened, they found that his relationship with Shelley began inappropriately, and he was guilty of infamous conduct. He was given a 6-month suspension, had to take an ethics course, and had to pay costs and fines totaling around $30,000. By this point, Shelley had already had their first of 3 children. And Jacqueline didn't want to push for more than the college determined on their own. She didn't want Shelley or her child to go without financial support. And maybe she'd even get to see her grandchild from time to time. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out that way. After the hearing, Jacqueline had very limited contact with Shelley for years in spite of her attempts at calling. she would pretty much just get hello out before Shelley would hang up. So Jacqueline started calling randomly, and instead of saying hello, she would just say, "I love you." So that would be what Shelley heard before hanging up. After Joe's 6-month suspension, he began practicing again, and in that time, he saw the Simmonds sisters, which led to their complaints that were filed in 1991. And because these were complaints number 2 and number 3 going to a hearing, he did have something to worry about. While the investigators were told it was unlikely he would lose his license entirely, he was probably facing a more severe penalty than if this had been the first complaint. If he was suspended for upwards of 2 years, he could lose $1 million in income, and he had a wife and at this point, 3 children to support. And this is a big deal because when he lost his income for 6 months with just 1 child to support, he had to refinance his house just to stay afloat. 2 years could very well bankrupt him. The police felt that they had gotten enough evidence to apply for a wiretap, and they bugged Joe's office on February 9th, less than 2 weeks after Sean's murder. For the month of February and then into March, the police kept Joe under surveillance in the hopes he would lead them to where Brian West was staying, which he eventually did one night. So now they had both men under watch. In the meantime, Katie had opted not to attend the hearing, so the complaint against Joe in that regard was dismissed. And honestly, I don't really blame her, seeing as what had happened to her sister. Now, though Joe led the police to Brian West, who was one part of the puzzle, the wiretap itself had not proven fruitful. If Joe felt free to talk anywhere, it would likely be not his office, but his home, and they wanted to place one in there. The issue was that Shelley didn't leave the house very often, or at least not for long enough to get them in there. But on March 9th, they saw her leave with the kids and took their chance. They managed to install a tap on the phone, and they put a listening device in the living room. Unfortunately, most of what they heard in the house was the noise of the television and the sounds of 3 rambunctious young children drowning out conversations, which is honestly the most relatable part of this case. The police eventually went back in the house to move the bug to the kitchen. But still, they hadn't picked up anything of use, and it was time to rattle the good doctor. On March 18th, the investigators showed up at Joe's office to interview him for the first time directly about Sean's murder. When they told him why they were there, he played it cool and was like, "What's this got to do with me?" All Joe really told them was that he hadn't seen Sean since 1991, and the complaint against him was not that big of a deal. But that was fine that that's all he gave, because the detectives didn't really have a plan to interrogate him. If Joe was innocent, he probably wouldn't think much about the interview. Maybe he'd mention it to his wife over dinner that the police had come by his office. If he was guilty, it could set him on edge, and maybe that would push him into making some phone calls or saying something incriminating where the wiretaps could hear him. Unfortunately, that did not work because the RCMP was unaware at the time that Joe was already worried he was being recorded. Since the day of David's arrest, Joe was being cautious about what he said and how he said it. What he did do was meet with Brian West in person, having his wife drive him away from the house while he ducked down in the passenger seat so that any surveillance wouldn't see him. After meeting with Brian, he did tell Shelley that Brian had shaved his beard, dyed his hair, and was making plans to leave town. Apparently, Joe thought that sounded like a good idea because the day after he saw Brian, he made an appointment to renew his passport. He then gave Shelley signing power over their bank accounts, a bit of power he had never given her before. More pressure would again be placed on Joe in early April, though not from a direction anyone suspected. A teenager, we're going to call her Becky, walked into an RCMP station. She had information about Joe, but not related to the murder. She accused Joe and her own father of sexual exploitation. Becky told the police that a year prior, when she was 16, her father, who was a drug addict, told her to go into the examination room with the doctor and do whatever he said. And what he asked for was sex. In exchange, Joe gave her father drugs. It wasn't until Becky had left her father's custody and moved in with her mother that she felt safe enough to go to the police. And with Becky's evidence, the police charged Joe and her father with sexual assault and exploitation in early April 1993, and it immediately hit the papers. Joe was named, but in order to protect the identity of the victim, her father's name was suppressed. Joe was then ordered by the college to stop examining female patients without a third party in the room. The restriction would be in place until the legal case was resolved. After this girl went to the police, her father called her, warning that if she didn't take back her accusations, the doctor would put a hit out on her. She told her father that she would tell the police she was lying, though she had no intention of doing so. She was just scared of her father and of Joe and said what she needed to in the moment. After she hung up, she reported the call to the RCMP and stood by what she told them had happened. So now the police were running 2 investigations, one into Sian's murder and one into the sexual abuse case. When they arrested Joe on the charges related to Becky, they used the opportunity to bug his car while he was waiting to make bail. But then there was a lull again. Nothing seemed to be moving, so the investigators decided to put more pressure on Joe. They sent undercover officers to his office to tell him that they needed to talk. The plan was to tell him that David asked for $10,000 to keep his mouth shut. Joe at this point did not know that he already talked, and they were banking on that. But as soon as the undercovers mentioned David, before they even got to the ask, Joe ordered them out of the office and called the police on them. Later that day, the undercovers called the office and Joe hung up on them. They immediately called back, and this time they got the answering machine. They said that David hadn't been paid enough and $10,000 would save Joe a lot of hassle. Joe didn't know who these men were or if they were really connected to David, but he saw the car they had gotten into and jotted down the license plate. He turned it over to his attorney, who had a PI run it. It came back with an odd registration that the PI had seen before with undercover government cars. So Joe's attorney called him and said these were likely police officers. David must have already talked. So Joe knew the police were almost surely listening in, following him around, and now they were sending undercover officers to try to pressure him into doing something to implicate himself. So what's that phrase? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you? Well, that's really the situation here. Joe was acting paranoid, but with reason. And he was trying to act normal. However, the stress was getting to him. He then felt more pressure when in early May 1993, David Schindler did plead guilty to second-degree murder just over 3 months after Sian's murder. He also pleaded guilty to the earlier attempted murder charge. When Joe heard that he pleaded out and it was not to first-degree murder, he was pretty sure some type of deal had been made. What Joe didn't know was that what David was offering, the Crown, wasn't all that much. According to David, in statements 3, 4, and 5, he was told not to kill Sian, just scare her. The investigators didn't believe him, but it would be hard to prove otherwise when you have the hitman saying it was not premeditated. It would actually take another witness coming forward to put that piece into place, and that person turned out to be Shelley Cheryl Lambos, the doctor's young wife. On May 18th, 1993, she called the police and left a number for them to call her back. The number was to a woman's shelter, where she had taken herself and her 3 children to escape from her abusive husband. The detectives went to the shelter to interview her. If you want a lot of detail on what Shelley went through during the time she was groomed by and then married to Joe, I recommend the book Fatal Prescription by John Griffiths, which I mentioned at the top of the episode as a source. It is linked in my sources, and Shelley and her family had been interviewed extensively for the book. We are just going to talk about things more or less in relation to the murder of Sian Simmonds. And for simplicity, I'm going to mash Shelley's various statements and eventual testimony together so that we can understand her full story, though we are going to get into some issues raised with it later. Shelley told the investigators that Joe was really worried about the hearings over the allegations from Sian and Katie, in spite of telling police they weren't a big deal. He couldn't afford to go without income for any length of a suspension due to his out-of-control gambling. They even ended up having to sell their house and move into a small rental, which Joe said was due to, quote, restructuring their finances, but the truth was he didn't have all that money he earned. He had lost most of it. Shelley also suspected Joe may have been in debt to someone because he started keeping a loaded shotgun nearby and had the children sleep in their bedroom with them. So when Joe found out that the complaints were going to a hearing, he called Katie to try to talk her out of going forward. He recorded the call and said to Katie that he didn't do anything to her and that he had always been there for her family when they needed him, and it really sounds like he was trying to get her to agree on tape that whatever happened between them wasn't inappropriate. But Katie stood her ground and even contacted the college about the call. On Joe's side of things, according to Shelley, he said he thought the girls had started believing their own lies, which he insisted were in fact lies that started when he shared medical information on Sian with her parents. She didn't want them to know whatever this information was, and that's why she made up an accusation to get back at him. When the college contacted Joe and told him to not call the sisters anymore, he told Shelley the only way to stop them from testifying was to kill them, because you can't threaten rats, or else they just rat about that too. Joe also ranted about the college and how they were biased against him since he was an immigrant, and how he should just take a gun and shoot up the panel. Shelley said she didn't come forward with these threats because this was not unusual. Joe's rants sometimes included homicidal fantasies towards people he believed wronged him, and that included Shelley's mother, Jacqueline. No one had been killed yet, so Shelley didn't take him seriously. What Shelley may not have known at the time was that after she moved in with Joe and her mother was pursuing that complaint against him, someone wadded up newspapers in Jacqueline's carport, which was right under her youngest child's bedroom, and lit it on fire. The car parked there became engulfed in flames, and the damage caused the horn to malfunction, and it started going off. That horn woke Jacqueline, and everyone managed to get out of the house. The car was a total loss, but thanks to Jacqueline waking up in time, the fire department arrived early enough to save the house. Joe was interviewed in relation to this arson, and though he was never charged, in my opinion, it looks possible that he had acted out on some revenge plan at least once before Sian's murder. After Joe was informed the complaints were going to a hearing, according to Shelley, he started taking the family for drives that would go by the Simmonds family home. Shelley said he was trying to figure out who drove which vehicle. And there is some evidence this is true because it turned out that Joe got a speeding ticket on November 24th while in their neighborhood. Eventually, Joe was able to link Sian with the red Jeep, but as far as Shelley knew, he never figured out which car Katie drove. Then, on January 27th, the day of the murder, Shelley said that Joe left the house after getting a call and came back 20 to 30 minutes later. He was agitated, and then the next day, he told Shelley to not do anything unusual going forward and to just follow their normal routine. A few days later, when David's arrest was made public to the media, Joe said they, quote, got the guy, and that the whole thing had cost him about $20,000. After he heard that David pleaded out, Joe told Shelley that David must have made a deal. And then he said they would have to wait until after sentencing, when David was put into general population, to do anything about him. Then, when they watched the news later and saw Sian's funeral covered, Joe made a comment about Sue, Sian's mother, looking depressed. Shelley agreed that she looked very sad. And according to Shelley, Joe said, that's what they deserve. They were trying to kill me. When Katie didn't show up at the hearing and it was canceled, Shelley said Joe laughed and said their father would never have risked a second daughter. Shelley took all of this in silence, as she had for the years she had been controlled and abused by Joe, starting when she was 15 and lasting until her mid-20s. She wanted a way out, but she didn't see one. She had dropped out of school after they had their first child, so she didn't have a diploma. She had no money of her own, and she was afraid of what would physically happen to her if she tried to leave. One day in the spring of 1993, after Sian's murder, and while Joe was extra moody due to his paranoia over the investigation, Sian met another parent at her kid's school named Scott. They chatted on the playground a bit, and after a couple of times meeting, Scott invited Shelley out to the movies, and she said yes. Shelley hired a babysitter one day when she knew Joe was at the horse track, and she went out on a date. That night, she and Scott began an affair. Even though she hadn't left Joe, this was her escape from the marriage. Scott, however, was also married, and his wife soon found out. She went to Shelley's house to confront her and put up quite a ruckus. Joe overheard and asked Shelley what was going on. Shelley told him that the woman accused her of having an affair with her husband, and then she waited to see Joe's response. His response was to laugh at the outrageous accusation. He was so sure of his control over Shelley that he truly believed she would never risk anything like that. He had even bragged to people at times that the best thing he did was marrying Shelley when she was so young, so he could mold her into the wife he wanted. The affair between Scott and Shelley did not last long because Scott decided to reconcile with his wife after this brief fling, so Shelley started trying to find another way to leave Joe. And she took a step on May 14th, not so much to leave Joe, but to test out defying him. When Joe said he wanted sex, Shelley broke the rule, and she actually said no. If Joe wanted sex, Shelley was expected to submit whether she wanted to or not. Even when she knew he was cheating on her, once bringing home a sexually transmitted infection, she still complied. And now, she wasn't. And Joe lost it. Initially, he left the house in a rage, but that wasn't much of a relief to Shelley because she knew it was only delaying the inevitable. It wasn't like Joe was going to cool down and then come back calm and collected. So she laid in bed, too scared to fall asleep, until Joe came back an hour later. He got water and ice and dumped it on her while screaming at her. He told her the marriage was over and she had until June 1st to move out or he would shoot her not once, but 100 times. And then Joe began a physical assault that lasted 2 hours and left Shelley with blurry vision for a week. Due to the bug in the kitchen, the police actually heard some of the storming around and even Shelley's screams. They considered sending a uniformed officer to the door to say a neighbor had called in a complaint about the noise, but instead, they waited to see if it would escalate. My opinion, and my opinion only, is that they were hoping that in this rage, Joe would say something incriminating him in Sean's murder, and they didn't want to interrupt it. And if that was what they were doing, they were taking a calculated risk the longer this went on, and that risk was Shelley's life. I get that the police have to make hard decisions all the time, but this one does not sit well with me. It makes me uneasy, to say the least, that they were listening to this woman being beaten by her husband and didn't intervene. The next morning, Shelley decided she had to leave immediately. She had few friends thanks to Joe's isolation, so she called the only person she thought would help her, and that was Scott. They hadn't spoken in well over a week by that point since he was reconciling with his wife, but Scott was a police officer, so he would know what to do. After Joe left the house that morning, Shelley packed up what she could fit into her minivan, got the kids in their car seats, and drove to a McDonald's to meet with Scott. She asked Scott if he thought the police could protect her if she came forward with what she knew. She wasn't so sure she was safe because Joe had told her during the attack the night before that even if he was in jail, he could get to her, so she better keep her mouth shut. Scott told Shelley that they could figure that part out later, but the first thing she needed to do was get to a shelter so she could have the resources and the protection she needed that day. And once they were there, that's when Shelley called the police. Meanwhile, though Joe had told Shelley that she had until the end of the month to move out, he was shocked she had actually left. And he was even more shocked that she had left without a trace of where she went. He started looking for her. He even put an ad in the paper offering a reward for her location. And according to Shelley, he also called the credit card company, pretending his name was Shelley and that he had lost his card. He asked if they could tell him the last few transactions to see if the card was stolen. The goal here was to get the transactions to narrow down where Shelley could be and to concentrate his search. But there was an issue. To verify his identity as Shelley, the customer service rep asked for the full birth date. And Joe didn't know it. He had been with Shelley for 10 years, and according to Shelley, he did not know the day, month, and year of her birth. After Shelley's statement to the police, they knew they had some good information from her, but like with David, they wanted some specific details to verify that she was telling the truth. A lot of what she said was just her witnessing Joe saying something, so did she have some information she got from Joe that she would have no other way of knowing? Maybe details about Brian West or about David or about the murder itself. But Shelley actually gave them something else. She gave them details on another murder. She said that she had learned through Joe that the hitman who killed Sean had also killed another man using the same insurance ruse to get access to his home. She said that this victim was a man who was shaving when he was killed. This information matched an unsolved case they had from April 1992, a year previous. A man named Charles Curtin had been released on bail on drug charges, and some of his associates believed he may have informed on them. A hit was taken out, and one morning a man knocked on Charles's door. The man said that Charles's wife had hit another car with her car and had sent him to the house to get the insurance information. Charles let the person in, and then he was shot to death. In an attempt to bring in tips, Crime Stoppers filmed and aired a reenactment. However, they purposely put an error into this reenactment. They showed Charles sitting at the table, reading a newspaper when he was shot. The truth was, he was in the middle of shaving. That was holdback information to vet tips that came in. And here Shelley was, with that piece of information that she should have no way of knowing otherwise. On May 28th, the police decided it was time to move forward. They moved in and arrested Joe first. He was found with his passport and $2,000 in American money with him. Brian was arrested later that same day, and they were both charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. Then nearly 3 weeks later, on June 16th, David was sentenced. He was facing a life sentence, but the question was, when would he be eligible for parole? His defense argued that he was a desperate drug addict who took the job to get out from under a debt and to save his own family. His plan was to just shove the gun in Sean's face and tell her if she testified, she would get it next time. He never intended to kill her, but panicked when she fought back and the gun went off. A 10-year non-parole period, which was the minimum, would be sufficient according to the defense. The Crown argued for a non-parole period of 20 years, which was what the judge opted for. David was also given a 15-year concurrent sentence for the earlier attempted murder. As David was led away from court, Katie Simmonds yelled, "Burn in hell," at him. After he was sentenced, David gave his 6th statement to the police. This statement is where he changes his story again. He claimed he still never planned to kill Sean, but admitted that he had been hired to do just that. He didn't want to do it, but Brian was threatening him, so he planned to go to Sean's apartment just to scare her into not testifying. But from there, things went wrong. And he was now willing to testify against the other two that this was in fact a planned hit. He had hesitated to admit this before, in my opinion, to get a lighter sentence, which kind of worked in the sense that he wasn't charged with first-degree murder like the other two. Joe Lambos went on trial first in October of 1994, but before the trial happened, additional charges of sexual assault towards patients were filed on behalf of 6 more victims who came forward. None of these cases would go to trial, which is the same thing that happened with the 16-year-old who came forward to accuse her father of selling her to Joe in exchange for drugs. All of the proceedings were eventually stayed, but there was some power in feeling safe coming forward. This was clearly a pattern with Joe. It wasn't just Shelley in the mid-'80s and Sean and Katie in the early 90s. Joe had been using his position as a doctor to prey on mostly teenagers and young women. When Joe did go to trial, which was for the murder, he opted for a judge rather than a jury. Shelley testified against him, and his attorney tore her apart on cross-examination. He pointed out that her initial statement to the police was a lot less dramatic than her testimony, particularly the specific parts where she said Joe more or less confessed to ordering the hit on Sean. She was accused of exaggerating and lying in order to get Joe sent to prison so she could keep all of the money and full custody. And the same thing happened when David testified. He said in 3 police statements and at his sentencing that he was only hired to scare Sean. But then his story changed. The defense hammered on his inconsistencies as well as the deal he got in exchange for his cooperation. He was moved to a different prison and his family was protected. But David did hold up pretty well on cross-examination and insisted this was a hired hit. After David testified and left the stand, he yelled, "See you in hell, Doc," which was echoing the words Katie Simmonds had yelled at him. Joe took the stand in his own defense to deny any involvement in the murder. He testified that he was not worried about the hearings related to Sian and Katie because he thought he would win after he had spoken with his attorney about it. And if he didn't win, it was likely going to be a light penalty since what they alleged happened really wasn't that bad in the grand scheme of things. Joe did back up some of Shelley's testimony, but more to put it in a different context. For instance, he did admit from the stand that he likely said something about having Sian and Katie killed, but it was out of anger and frustration. He didn't mean it. He also admitted that he drove by their house repeatedly, getting a speeding ticket that one time. But he said he wasn't doing covert surveillance on anyone. It was just because he was trying to build up the courage to go to the door and speak with the family face-to-face about the accusations. Joe testified that he did talk to Brian West about the complaints in late 1992 and asked Brian if he would go talk to them and tell them not to lie about these accusations. He didn't expect Brian to be violent with them, but he was aware that Brian looked scary. He was the stereotypical biker type. He had a big build, he had a beard, he had tattoos. So he seemed the perfect candidate to just make them scared by his presence. Joe said he was shocked when he learned that Sian had been killed, and he had no idea who David Schlender was. After he realized the police might be looking at him as a suspect, he did go to Brian to find out what was going on. And that's when he learned that Brian had hired someone else to go confront Sian and Katie. Brian said that David panicked when there was a struggle and killed Sian, even though he was told just to threaten her. Joe denied from the stand that he ever paid Brian West for any of this. The Crown argued the logic of the situation. Why would Brian West give David gloves, a loaded gun, and a silencer if there was no intent to kill Sian? Joe denied knowing that Brian gave any of those things to David. But then you have to wonder, why would Brian take it upon himself to turn this situation into a murder for hire? If we take Dr. Joe out of the equation, we're also removing the motive. It makes no sense. The defense countered that at most, Joe was guilty of manslaughter for unintentionally setting things in motion, but certainly not guilty of premeditated murder. The judge disagreed and found Joe guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. He was given 2 concurrent life sentences and would not be eligible for parole for 25 years. With Joe sent away, the next trial was Brian West's, which was held in October 1995. This trial was similar to Joe's as far as the key witnesses went. But they had a bit more on Brian since he was a little more talkative while the police were bugging his home and phone. In one conversation with a friend, he gave some specific details of Sian's murder, like how she fought back and had been hit in the head as she was punching and kicking David. The friend made a comment about how this murder wasn't as easy as the first one, and Brian replied in the affirmative. The first murder referred to is not clear, but it is believed by some that it was Charles Curtin. It appeared that Brian had found this middleman position rather lucrative. He would charge the person who ordered the hit a lot more money than he paid the hitman. He was caught on the wiretap saying he had been paid $20,000 to set up Sian's murder, but only paid the hitman $5,000. Pocketing the extra and not having to do any of the dirty work himself. Brian's defense was that he wasn't involved in this. He said that Joe and David both bought cocaine from him, so any financial matter or arrangement or moving of money between them had to do with drug sales. He said that if the two of them worked together to murder Sian, it was done without his help or his knowledge. His defense said that the audio recordings that seemingly implicated him were mostly unintelligible, and they had to be enhanced, which then altered what was actually said. The jury did not buy it and found Brian West guilty after 2 hours of deliberation. He too was given a life sentence with no parole eligibility until 25 years. David Schlender, who had the lightest sentence, never made it out of prison. He died in December of 2006, still behind bars. Though the cause of death has not been publicly released, it's believed it was from an illness. Brian West was granted day parole in 2016 after serving 23 years in prison. He was then granted full parole. As for Dr. Joe Charalambos, he has applied for parole at least 3 times starting in 2018. In 2018 and 2020, the parole board found that he had a number of complaints against him while incarcerated, including being combative with other inmates and, I'm not kidding here, hogging the TV and phone privileges. So imagine an entitled man who bullied his way through life continued to do so in prison. The parole board found that Joe lacked real reflection on the impact of his crime, and the remorse he verbalized appeared to be superficial at best. His most recent denial was this year, in 2023, as I'm recording this. After 29 years in prison, the board found that the now 71-year-old still showed a moderate risk of reoffense. Though he had done some work in prison counseling other inmates, the parole board noted that his target victims, which were teens and young women, were not around him in prison. They also said his entitlement, arrogance, and ego were still issues. It had been suggested to Joe that he first apply for escorted temporary absences. This means he and a couple other inmates and a guard would go out into the community for a few hours at a time. That would show that he had reformed and that he wasn't a risk to women in the general public out in the community. But Joe opted not to apply for that because he decided that he was ready for day parole. Therefore, he should get day parole because he said so. I think we can see what they mean when they're talking about his entitlement, arrogance, and ego. Joe Charalambos remains in prison while Sean's family tried to enact change in Canada as they saw factors that led to where they were, the frustrated family of a murder victim. For one, they disagreed with how the College of Physicians and Surgeons handled complaints, taking a year or more to investigate and then setting up hearings for months in advance. This was a 33-year-old man in a sexual relationship that started when his victim was 15, and he was allowed to continue practicing medicine. The college had actually written somewhat favorably of the relationship, noting that Shelley's grades improved after moving in with Joe. And anyone who sees any upside to the situation of a teen being groomed and abused needs to reassess and wonder how their thinking went so very wrong. Sean's family advised people to stop taking sexual assault claims to the college and go straight to the police, which is what they wish they had done with Katie and Sean's accusations. Of course, we know Shelley's mother tried that, and it didn't work in that case. Sean's family also found that after the murder, the legal process put an unfair burden on the family. Brian and Joe's trials were severed early on, so the family would then have to sit through 2 trials. No company gives you paid leave for a 6-week trial, let alone 2. And to compound that, both trials were moved out of the area due to the pretrial publicity, and now the family was facing the financial burden of travel as well. It is a good argument for something we've seen here in the U.S. Rather than moving the entire trial to a different jurisdiction, they will bring the jury in from across the state. Jurors have more legal protections against things like job loss than victims' families have. Sean's family also wanted to see changes in bail qualification. A man who was accused of attempted murder was able to rather quickly bail out. And then while on bail, he killed their daughter. Bail for violent offenses should, in their opinion, be much more carefully considered. So it felt like, on top of grieving the loss of their daughter, the Simmonds family ran into so many obstacles. They decided to be public about it, as much as it hurts to relive that trauma, with their goal being to make a change so that no other family had to go through what they did. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.